Toil, 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 toil. Toil, toil, toil. Why do I not know what I'm saying? It doesn't start with toil. Toil, 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 toil. What is up with me? Double, double toil and trouble. Welcome to the deep dive on witchcraft. The deep dive on witchcraft. Now, this is such an expansive topic that we really could talk about it for hours and hours and hours. I think I can do so many deep dive, video essays on this subject. But today we're just gonna go over skimming the little surface. We're gonna talk about witchcraft around the world, how it shows up in some major cultures around our world. We're going to talk about the infamous witch hunts, the misunderstandings about these witch hunts, and all the misinformation going around on witch talk. I also want to break down the major symbolisms that come with this trope of the witch, like the black, straight-brimmed, pointed hats, riding on a broom, cauldrons, potions, pentagrams, and more. I want to dive into what we believe is a witch, what is portrayed in the media as a witch, and what that means to us. And, you know, from the past, how we can reclaim that witch wound. And also how, yes, this whole witchcraft feminism spike, it does have some weight to it, but also there's a lot of misinformation and there's so much more than that in the tale, in the history of the witch. I have been researching my little butt off, reading books, watching videos and documentaries, and looking at scholarly articles to understand what this idea of a witch means to us now and has meant to us throughout history. So without further ado, let's dive right on in. So what is a witch? Originally, the term witch is believed to be derived from Old English, with the words Wicca for a man and wick for a woman, which is also believed to be the root for the word wicked. That is the most well-believed and known place that it has come from. However, there is so many different theories about the roots of the word witch from English in the UK, but also with terms like bruja from Mexico and Latin America, and other definitions of the word witch from all around the world. They do come from different roots. And all of these different terms for witch have rooted meanings in words from wicked to divine to sacred to unwitting. So really there's just so much that this word and definition holds. And now you may think of witch and think of the black pointy hat, riding on a broom with her black cat and stirring in her little cauldron. But there are lots of different types of witches, and this is in today's practice, but it's also throughout history. There's the satanic witch, the Halloween monster witch who's green like the Wizard of Oz. There is the Wicca religion, and also just other type of witches that have been erased, that are demonized, or even some that are in popular culture now with witch talk, with crystals, with manifestation. There's this idea around the burning times or witch hunters and the witch hunting times that I do want to dive into a bit later in today's video. But from the idea of burning times and witch hunting comes the idea of pagan witches, especially in the UK and North America. It's this idea of these women practicing pagan witchcraft and pagan rituals under the cover of darkness or secretly within their houses. They have covens in their houses and they're secretive about it so the church doesn't find them out. And while actually a lot of the times, as we'll say, this wasn't even truly what was happening, the idea of the pagan witch and pagan traditions and pagan rituals is a little bit broad. Yes, you can have pagan Celtic witchcraft in all of these different areas, but the true definition of pagan is someone who holds spiritual or religious beliefs outside of the majority or mainly recognized religion of the time and of our time now. So back during the burning times, we did have Catholicism, we did have Christianity that was on the rise, that was really the main attraction. And so things like witchcraft or just religions and beliefs that predated Christian times were seen and referred to as pagan. Pagan is not an actual religion in and of itself, despite what We may believe now you can have Greek pagan beliefs, you can have Celtic pagan beliefs. There's so many things. So it's not just paganism as a whole. It's a little more nuanced than that. There are ideas of this pagan witch going back to some sort of roots of prior to Catholicism and Christianity. There's African witches, Asian witches, South American witches, like Mexican, Venezuela, Colombian witches. There's so many types of witches outside of this idea that we have of just that pagan UK American witch that I really want to talk about as well. There are what many believe to be satanic witches, which I think do exist, but it's the same as like there's always going to be really intense people in any sort of religious belief, right? It's the same as like people who truly, truly believe that essential oils will like cure their cancer, right? It's like that might be a little bit more extreme, but that doesn't show the beliefs of everyone. There's also Wiccan and neo-pagan witches. There's the fairy tale witches and the medieval witches that you hear. Often these are like old haggard women that cast spells or curses and things like that. Or you have Glenda the good witch who comes down in a bubble.
She wore a crown and she came down in a bubble, dog!
There's folk witches who are often taught from ancestors. There's like Italian folk witchcraft and German folk witchcraft and Spanish folk witchcraft. And then there's just like your generic witch, you know, your generic Halloween witch, like we were talking about before. So as you can see, there's just too many types of witches. There's too many things that can be explored and discovered, and you can dive just deeper and deeper and deeper into it. And these styles of witchcraft often get blurred in the media. So you might have a pagan witch blended with that satanic witch. And even though they are not one and the same, they become one and the same within our mind. And this has happened a lot with the darker sides of witchcraft, with the darker beliefs and propaganda around witchcraft, and it gets blended with other areas. And this just makes it so convoluted because there is so much media out there, whether that is a made-up fairy tale witch, or whether that is like in Wizard of Oz, Harry Potter, things like that, or whether it's actual, you know, of this earth witchcraft like Wicca or folk magic or things like that. There's just so much media that it gets so convoluted and confusing. And that's the main thing I want to do today, is maybe make it a little less confusing. If there are any areas that I sort of touch on and you would love me to do an even deeper dive into that subject, I would love to do that. So let me know, leave a little comment and let me know, and I will do that. But with that idea of what is a witch, let's now look at what is witchcraft. A lot of people think of witchcraft as Wicca or astrology or tarot cards or crystals or herbalism. When it comes to New Age witchcraft, if you're watching this because you're like, I think I want to be a witch, I want to see like outside of the fairy tales and the media of it all, what is witchcraft like at its core in reality, in this New Age spiritual witchcraft time. There's lots of types of witches. So just to start off, you can be a coven-based witch, which means you only work within a group with other people. And then you also have solitary-based witches. With the way society works now, a lot of the time, you will be a solitary witch. If you do wish to be a coven witch, don't just join any old group, any old people. Try and join people who you really vibe with, trusted people. And if it doesn't vibe with you, maybe you can swap in between, sometimes being a coven witch when you find your right people and sometimes being a solitary one. So here's the types of witches you can be as a solitary or a coven witch. So there is hereditary or an ancestral witch. This is someone who works either with their ancestors or who has had their spells and grimoires and witchcraft and beliefs passed down to them from ancestors. There's a crystal witch, which is pretty self-explanatory, I think. There is a cosmic witch, and those are the ones who work with the stars, the planets, astrology, quantum leaps. We have green witches who just work with nature in general. There is hedge witch and plant witch. Green, hedge, and plant are all sorts of nature-based, earth-based witches. They just have different niches and specialities within them. You can have light, dark, or gray witches. Gray witches use both light and dark magic depending on the situation. You can have a folk witch, which is not necessarily passed down in their family but passed down in their culture. So you get a lot of Italian witchcraft or Spanish witchcraft. This is the realm of culture and places. You have a kitchen witch, who I am trying to identify as. I'm just starting, but working with herbs, working in the kitchen, working with food. You have the hearth witch. This is one who's going to be making things like simmer pots more. It can be kind of similar to a house or a kitchen witch, but it's kind of like both altogether. It's just working with different energies of the home, working within the space. A house witch is working within the space, but specifically you might be, cleansing your space. It's different cleaning magic more than just in the kitchen. You have ceremonial witches who do a lot of rituals, who work with moon phases a lot. You have a moon witch. This can also be a cosmic witch, but if you just work with the moon witch. You can have like a sacral fire, sacred sexuality witch, and then you can also just have a traditional witch who follows things like Wicca, things like grimoires, and stuff like that. You can also have a baby witch, which is someone just starting out and discovering what they like. And also you can have an eclectic witch, which I also really vibe with, which is just taking a little bit from each practice. You're not just in one niche. So there's so much you can do. Even I could do just a deep dive into green witchcraft, just into kitchen witchcraft. So I just wanted to let you know the types, and if any of those sparked a feeling within you, check them out, try them out, or let me know and I'll do a deep dive on them for you. So with this idea of all the different types of witchcraft you can do, now let's get into witchcraft around the world. So let's just start UK, North America. This is what we often refer to and know as paganism. This is a lot of elemental and green witchcraft. They use tools such as brooms, cauldrons, teas, herbs. A lot of the idea of magic and of witchcraft that we have in North American cultures, or even some European cultures, are very based in this paganism, UK, North America witchcraft. But that being said, there's also other European witches. There's German, Danish, Italian. When I lived in Denmark, there was this story of these Danish witches who came together and they sunk a ship that was going to I can't remember exactly. I don't know if they're making a trade deal or something, but all the witches got together and the witches were blamed for sinking this ship, but ultimately it helped the country, which is really interesting. There's lots of types of witchcraft in Europe, but I really want to talk about Italian. Italian witchcraft is really tied to tarot. It's considered by many the birthplace of tarot. I think tarot is also very, very ancient, and it can be seen before this throughout history, but what we know of today as tarot really is believed to date back to Italy. They're also known for a lot of kitchen witchcraft as well. They're folk magic. This is where that culture gets passed down. It's very Italian witchcraft. I was watching this video from this Italian witch who lives in Italy, and she said no one would refer to themselves in Italy nowadays as a witch or as I think a stregheria is sorry, my Italian accent, my Italian is not good. I'll put it here. And that really started around 1899 in the Gospel of Witches. So this magic goes back further, but that name came around in 1899, and so they don't always use it because in Italy, with the rise of the church, you would not call it witchcraft openly because they either don't see themselves truly as witches, some are reclaiming the word, but also they don't feel safe in using that word within their society. It's often embedded into small villagers and is also just embedded into their way of life. They don't know it as witchcraft, they know it as their way of life. She was saying that her and her aunties and her mother and her siblings and her cousins, they all regularly go to tarot readers. It's just always been a way of their life there, and it's not considered witchcraft, or it's not considered magic and things like that. It's just considered their way of life. A lot of the rituals and witchcraft that you hear about in Italy is been based in Catholicism with saints and local saints and superstitions. It's kind of taken what they had before and blended in with what they have now and what is really accepted within their communities. French and Italian witches actually have very similar roots because France did control Italy for a while. So they actually have many similar practices and many similar rituals. And this can be seen even in the tarot. Like we have more of a classic tarot that started as a card game in Italy. And then we have the Marseille tarot that came from France. And while they're a little bit different, they're very similar. And even a lot of people in Italy still use the Marseille tarot to this day. A lot of Italian witchcraft that's like in books and in today's culture is very Americanized. It's shifted, it's taken this like American idea of paganism and witchcraft and these rooted Italian rituals and married together. Because like I said, in Italy, they don't necessarily see it as witchcraft. It's just a way of life, but it's brought into, you know, Italian Canadian, Italian Americans, and it's brought into this idea of this folk magic. And while some people in Italy may feel that it's magic and it's witchcraft, it's really a lot of people trying to call in their Italian cultures from other places through the form of witchcraft that write these books and do these things. We do get this idea of the maid, the mother, and the crone, which is in a lot of witchcraft practices and even referenced in Wicca itself. And this does have a lot of roots in Italy, actually, and it does come from that, you know, Holy Trinity, but working with Mary instead as the maid, the mother, and the crone. They also work with saints and angels. It's similar to goddess and deity work in Greek mysticism and deity work in UK paganism, but it's a bit more rooted in Catholicism or Christianity. And overall, tarot is just, like I said, very big. They use the Marseille tarot. It's very slightly different from the classic Rider-Waite. You wouldn't often see Rider-Waite actually over in Italy, despite what the media may portray in movies and in other forms of media, but it did start as a tarot game, and that's why sometimes the Marseille deck can be a little bit different because it didn't originally function the same way as the Rider-Waite did, where the Rider-Waite was made to read. There's so much more I could say about Italian witchcraft and European witchcraft as a whole. Like there's such an interesting rabbit hole that we just don't have time for today if you go down the German witchcraft route. Now I want to talk about African and indigenous witchcraft. There's a lot of closed practices here, especially because witchcraft itself is sort of demonized. And when you look at people who faced prejudice, who have faced and still do face discrimination, such as African and indigenous cultures, their witchcraft is theirs. And a lot of it is a closed practice, whereas a lot of things like the UK paganism is very open for you to explore and try. So if this is not part of your culture, this is not part of your history, don't tap into things like voodoo magic and things like that that come from African witchcraft. So that being said, African and indigenous witchcraft have things like voodoo in them, African and religious beliefs. A lot of what is seen as indigenous witchcraft would not be called in indigenous communities as witchcraft. That is how it's stereotyped outside of it. It is more medicine, healing, and shamanism and things like that. There's a lot of really sad history and still sad claims today, especially around African witchcraft. There's stories of cannibalism and there's other scare tactics to try and demonize this set of beliefs and religion. A lot of African traditions from pre-colonial times were seen and are seen now as witchcraft by those who colonized, invaded, and this is often still believed to this day. It was made so that it was easier for people to take over, easier to shift them to things like Catholicism, like Christianity, like their own beliefs, saying this is wrong, this is demonized. We need to let them see the light of God. And this is why some areas in Africa villainized it and others didn't. It depended on if it was colonized, it depended on how many colonizers were around, and if they were being forced into those beliefs or not, and if they were being demonized. And this is why I say with African witchcraft or indigenous witchcraft, so many of the practices are closed because it's not just witchcraft. It's not just spiritual traditions like it was in UK paganism or Greek mysticism. This is religious beliefs and a certain culture's religion. It's not something for us to play with. This is not an open practice witchcraft. This is a culture's sacred beliefs and a culture that was discriminated against and hurt and villainized by other cultures, and those cultures really have no right to be practicing those religious beliefs under a name such as witchcraft. that it's not even called in the first place. Now, next I want to talk about Asian witchcraft, just like African witchcraft. Like, this is a whole continent, same as European. So, you know, there's not as much that I can get really, really in deep and specific. Often a lot of Asian witchcraft is overlooked as spiritualism, but a lot of Asian spiritual beliefs has seeped its way into modern day witchcraft and Western New Age spirituality and witchcraft. Things like chakras, sound healing, astrology, which actually started in India but was further developed in Greece, Ayurveda, Atharvaveda, which is charms and spells. All of these things did start in Asian spiritualism, or even sometimes in what is called Asian witchcraft. India did come out, I mean, it's actually quite recent, with India's Witch Prohibition Act of 1999. So it is prevalent in Asian cultures as well, but it often gets glossed over as just spiritualism. There's Japanese shamanism, also known as Shinto. I'm really sorry if I'm saying anything wrong. I'm trying my best, but there's lots of terms. And actually in Japanese culture, witch is used with positive connotations. There's also Chinese witchcraft. It's seen through mysticism and art and religion. The moon is very highly regarded in Chinese culture and religion, which does match up with the moon witch definition. They also have their own form of shamanism, and they use a lot of animal magic and the Chinese zodiac. You know what I mean? It's all very reminiscent of little snippets of UK paganism and witchcraft, but with older roots. There's also the Philippines Mangkukulam or Kulam. Once again, sorry if I'm saying that wrong. I'll spell it on the screen. And also Mama Barang, which are healers, but often also used as scapegoats in a witch hunt sort of way. So it is very prevalent, and I would love to dive into those topics as well so much more, but now on to South America, our last continent. We have witch trials in South America that were held for women who practiced priestesshood rather than the name of witchcraft. And despite what many believe, these were some of the only women in the world who were actually actively practicing spiritual or religious witchcraft that were put to trial. So I'm going to talk about what happened with the witch trials in US, America, Canada, and the UK soon. But a lot of the times those women weren't actually practicing witchcraft, but these women in South America actually were, which is kind of badass. Because of the push of Christian beliefs at this time, non-Christian beliefs were seen and framed as evil and demonic in order to ostracize these individuals and to ostracize indigenous cultures and also the African culture of any freed slaves. And this extended into South America from North America. 15th century colonization did cause, similar to Italy, the deep spiritual and witchy nature of Latin America to fuse with Christian ideals. So you kind of had this like Frankenstein effect like they did in Italy, where it's like, okay, what we believed, these Christian ideals, and how can we mash them together? How can we sort of not lose this magic that we do still believe in? There was a lot of folk magic, and we continue to see now a rise in folk magic in Caribbean, African, and Latin cultures with those sorts of witchcraft. And they have a lot of food-based witchcrafts. A lot, I think, of like kitchen witchcraft and folk magic do go hand in hand because it is things that you just do in the home. This is where we actually get cacao ceremonies and even just our cocoa drinks. This was actually used as a form of spiritual and religious beliefs as these witches, as these indigenous cultures. And when colonizers came in, they loved it too much and they were like, no, we gotta keep this. So there is a lot of South American kitchen witchcraft and folk magic that's embedded within their culture. I do find that South America and African as well, I'd say these two are sadly the most prejudiced spaces that you can find online about witchcraft. When you look up Mexican witches or Latin witches or South American witches, a lot of things that you do find on Google, on YouTube, online, in papers and books is content that creates shame and fear around this type of craft. Titles like exposés on Mexican witchcraft, black magic, how to ruin a person's life, hexes, and other fear tactics and clickbait are used to create content and media around this circle of witchcraft. And it's very sad because this just comes back from a time where colonizers and people who were invading and Catholicism and Christianity was trying to ostracize other beliefs and cultures. And I would really love to see a shift in this in the online space. And we've seen this throughout history, and we hear about it all the time throughout history of the ostracization of the witch in witch trials, in burnings, in the burning times, which is often referred to as a big time for witch hunts in the UK and in North America and other places around the world as well. Europe, South America, all of these places. But usually it's really pinpointed to the UK and to America. There's actually a lot of misconception around this. So one of the beliefs is that midwives were targeted because they knew a lot about herbs and they knew a lot about herbal medicine, and this was seen as witchcraft and it threatened the patriarchy. However, this wasn't true. Sometimes in rare cases, there are going to be exceptions to this, but a lot of the times midwives were needed and they were looked up to. They were just needed in the society, so they weren't going to be burned and seen as witches unless they were not liked and the city, the town, the country needed a scapegoat. And actually, a lot of the time, midwives were part of the witch hunt. They would identify witch marks and they would help the accuser accuse a witch through their medical knowledge. There's this idea that millions of witches were burned. That's not true. It was still a lot. It was like thousands, maybe tens to thousands, but it was not millions. It was not, everyone and their mother being burned. That doesn't take away from the sad lives that were lost and the horrible atrocity that it was, but it wasn't millions. And a lot of these witches, I hate to say it, didn't even actually practice witchcraft, which I felt like was well known, but maybe it's not. And it's a really nice sentiment. You've seen at feminist rallies, like people holding up signs and it says, "We are the daughters of the witches you couldn't burn," being like, we are strong women, we are witches. And you see it within the witch talk community and the witch online space. However, a lot of the people who were burned didn't even practice witchcraft, weren't pagan, and were actually Christian belief, or at the very least, they weren't practicing witchcraft. So most of these ancestors that were burned or ancestors that weren't burned, they weren't actually witches. They would only usually confess to witchcraft after excessive torture, which is really sad. They were forced into admitting that they were a witch just to get whatever was happening to them to stop. It is a bit of a generalization that witchcraft and the burning times and all of this is linked to feminism. Of course, a lot of women were targeted, and a lot of strong women and women who posed a threat to the church, to the patriarchy, they were accused and they were burned. But actually, with the Salem witch trials, which is the most prevalent one that we often hear about, those accused of witchcraft were actually the most vulnerable in the community. So the first three women were Sarah Good, who was a homeless beggar, Sarah Osborne, an invalid outcast, and Tituba, who was an indigenous slave. These were all people that it was really convenient for the church to blame for the hard times the town was facing, rather than say, why isn't God answering our prayers? They would say, it's witches. The witches are cursing us. They are holding back our good luck for crops, our good fortune. And a lot of the times, like I said, they weren't actually practicing witchcraft. They were just a good scapegoat and were tortured into admitting that they were a witch. I'm not saying that this feminist movement around witchcraft isn't amazing. I think we should reclaim the word witch. I think healing the witch wound is so important. But I do think that this idea of witchcraft and the burning times and all of that and the witch trials is a way to have people finally look at women's history and take it seriously. Women's history is not learned unless it's about misogyny and feminism, and therefore actually still tied to the patriarchy and men. Why don't we learn about what these women were doing outside of the idea of the patriarchy, because to me that's so much more feminist than always tying it to fighting against the patriarchy. A lot of women's history is fighting against the patriarchy because we have been oppressed, and we are. And there's still injustices around the world today. However, I don't think women's history should always be taught in the face of feminism, and sometimes it just should be women's history for women's history's sake. There's this idea that witches were hanged, drowned, buried, burned. Actually, burned and drowned were not as common as you think. There were burnings, but often if they were burned, they weren't burned alive. So there's a lot of misinformation around that. Even with the drowning, there's this story, which I even believed, of like, we'll throw her in the lake, and if she sinks, she is human, but she dies, but if she floats, she's a witch, and then she's burned or whatever. A lot of the times, the women who were thrown in, if they did sink, they were rescued and they were proved to not be a witch. So this isn't necessarily true, but it's a very good story. There's a lot of different covens and religions, like the Green Man, who were mixed together with paganism, but not necessarily true. It's just a nice story that historians wove together. So always make sure when you're hearing about witchcraft that you're also doing your due diligence and see what is actually true, or just maybe taking everything with a grain of salt. Now, along with the misinformation of the burnings themselves and who the witches were, there's also a lot of misinformation here about what those witches were actually practicing. Like I said, paganism wasn't actually a specific religion on its own, but rather an umbrella term used for ancient religions outside of Christianity and Catholicism. People would never have identified themselves as pagan, and a lot of the time they were actually ancient or older interpretations of Christianity. They were just more ritualistic based. The Middle Ages in the UK was actually a lot less pagan than we're led to believe, and this really just came from this paranoia of demonology at the time. And also from the conflict between the Catholics and the Protestants. The Catholics being more ritualistic, and therefore the Protestants saying that they were pagans, that they were practicing witchcraft, that they were practicing demonology in this ritualistic way. You would see pictures and warnings in books from the time of witches riding broomsticks. Male witches were not unheard of, but this was tied. But the idea of witches is tied with a feminist thread where women were believed to be more weak-minded and therefore susceptible to the tricks of the devil. Ooh. And it just held a lot of fear. It was actually Victorian times that gives us this romanticized idea of pagan rituals and witchcraft and magic, because they romanticized so much, and they romanticized things like ancient magic and folklore and witchcraft and paganism. And this cemented what we know and believe as witchcraft today, not what was actually even practiced. A lot of historians from the Victorian time would cling to the fact that strange or odd artifacts were linked to paganism rather than finding the roots of the actual sub-religion and culture it was from. And therefore we get this idea throughout history of pagans, even though they never really existed and no one would call themselves that. And honestly, this is in a same vein as Wicca. I love Wicca. I love you witches. I'm not coming for you. I always say you need to look at your roots. And for a long time, I believed those roots were in Wicca until I found out the term Wicca was only introduced as a religion and as a name in the 1950s. Wicca itself does have a long history, but that's because Wicca means male witch in Old English. Like I said at the beginning, back in the very early years, 890 AD, the term Wicca was used as male witch, and that is where this religion gets its name. Now, it can have roots in ancient practices, but what I am trying to say is that Wicca as a religion itself did not come about until around the 1950s. When it was introduced, it's rooted in the concept of trying to reconstruct a perceived history of witchcraft and paganism, and it hinges on those burning times that also do have a lot of misinformation about them. It has the idea that it has to be 13 coven member with a priest or a priestess or a witch priest. And unfortunately, Gardner, who was the former creator of Wicca, he sort of started the whole thing. He was very homophobic, he's very sexist, but the religion has grown so far past that. The beliefs of him should not be held to the people who now practice Wicca. Wicca is very important, and it's not Satanism and it's not devil worshipping. It does have roots in perceived ancient practices of paganism, but it doesn't actually date back as a religion itself to those times. So now that we've talked a lot about the history of the witch and the history of witchcraft, I want to talk about media tropes, iconography, and this idea we've had throughout our lives and growing up of what is a witch.
I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog too.
So starting with this idea of the witch trope. Of course, there will be exceptions to this, but I'm talking about a trope. I'm talking about a majority. It's like romance tropes. They're not all going to follow the exact same, but they do still exist, and the witch trope exists as well. Usually this witch trope is the outsider, either by choice or against their own will. They're on the margins of society. She has a difference against these mere mortals and is trying to reconcile them. Or not, sometimes pushing right against them. She has a social circle of other women, like a coven. She has magical powers. She exerts her will to get what she wants, whether that be through power, through will, whatever that is, through action, through her speech, but she exerts her power. Not always conventionally attractive, and that's to reflect her inner nature. We do have that like old hag witch, something like that, but even though she's not outwardly as necessarily as beautiful, very, very vain. So sometimes you have those witches who are stealing youth, right? And then they are very beautiful, but it's like, you know, they've just used their magic to get that way. They're often unmarried, and they also often hate children. We see these tropes in things like practical magic with a coven. We see it with the Wicked Witch of the East in The Wizard of Oz, and children's movies like Hocus Pocus. You see this unconventionally attractive or not conventionally attractive witch who hates children, who's using her magic to usually do things that others don't want or to get her further along. Witches are often women who transgress society's idea of femininity and what a woman should be. They overstep society's boundaries for what's acceptable for a woman and how they should act and how they should present themselves, who they should be. They are often too old, too powerful, too sexually aggressive. They're too vain, too undesirable. There's a quote from Wizard of Oz, right? There's the beautiful Glenda, the good witch, right? And she just helps people and she has kindness in her heart and she's beautiful. And she says, only bad witches are ugly.
But I've never heard of a beautiful witch before.
And these are the witches who are too powerful. These are the witches who go against society's expectations. It's saying an unhinged woman is not attractive and therefore is bad. And the witch trope itself has become like a Halloween character. It has become a monster in some tropes of the witch, but the root is in real historical terror. Like we were talking about before, witch hunts usually sprung from a period of hardship that left people looking for a scapegoat and looking for someone to blame. And in these movies, in this media, it's like, yes, the woman who is too powerful, the woman who is childless, the woman who goes against perceived ideas of femininity, that's who to blame and who to villainize in our story. The witch trope also plays off fear of women's knowledge and intuition. This can be seen as early as plays like Macbeth by Shakespeare, where we have the three witches, kind of like the three fates in Greek mythology, and where the three fates in Greek mythology were feared, they were also revered, right? They held a lot of power, and so you had to respect them. But in things like Macbeth, they're seen as old and haggard and scary, seen as tricky. They have the information, but they won't give you all the real information. They will keep it to themselves and make you weave a sick and tragic tale. On the other side of the coin, the witch is often seen as over-sexualized and beautiful, but she's gained this in ways that are not moral.
I am beautiful.
She's seen as a way to trick and fool and manipulate men. She's seen as toxic. And this is versus the wizard or the sorcerer, the male counterpart who is often desexualized, who is old and wise and powerful and helpful and kind. And even if they withhold information, it's for the better. It's for the better of others, or they were trying to do what was best rather than to manipulate. Male wizards are seen as proceeding with care and caution, while female witches are seen as manipulative and overbearing. There's the trope that witches often disguise themselves as young and beautiful, and they're painted as vain, like the witch, the wicked witch, wicked stepmother in Snow White. And that they chase this beauty, they chase this eternal youth, which all women should want, right? A lot of these maidens in the stories possess, and the witches try to steal because they're evil and deranged. And this is done through violent means. And it also really pushes that fear of women using their appearance as deception, which is a big problem to the patriarchy. It's like, oh, a woman can't fool me. Linked even to that idea of like, take a woman swimming on the first date. And it's just sort of like, why are you so afraid that you will find a woman beautiful? Why is that a scary thing? Fear of the witch is not actually supernatural. It's of a woman not fitting our expectations and us not knowing how to put her in a box. So we put her in this box of an undesirable witch, a manipulative witch. Maybe sometimes the W isn't used. Recently, we have seen a shift. We've seen it with witch talk. We've seen it with people embracing the term of witch and using their magic again. We're seeing it through villainous retellings with the POV being on characters like Maleficent, where we get their backstories and character arcs. This is also seen in Wicked, which I'm excited to see. We also see another subgenre here of the relatable witch. This started actually back in 1942 with the rise of the teen witch, and we see it in things like Sabrina. We see it in Practical Magic. It's the story of fantasy and wish fulfillment and coming of age for young girls who are reckoning with their power versus society. Society makes them feel weak, and their power, their magical powers, give them an edge, and she becomes a feminist icon. It starts to make younger girls believe that the witch can do anything, and anything is actually possible for her when she steps into her own power and embraces it. So I do think that there is something to be said that the witch trope is getting better, but I think that older trope will always exist. It's just important to watch out for it, and it's important to recognize it for what it is. And now, on that topic of tropes, I want to talk about witches' iconography and the history and truth behind them of this classic, especially this Halloween witch, and things we see with witches a lot. So starting with broomsticks, there's actually a pagan witchcraft old practice that was done in the UK. I'm going to refer to it as pagan just because that's a lot of what you do find in historical research and things like that, even though paganism, like we said, it's not its own one thing. But there is a pagan witchcraft old practice that I think riding on that broomstick comes from, where they're like flying it through the sky. It was this thing called broomstick dancers that farmers and like wives of farmers often did, where they would jump around on a broomstick or a pole or a pitchfork under the full moon around the crops, and it was supposed to aid in crop fertility and have a more abundant harvest as well. Brooms are also used in many witchcraft and pagan practices to sweep away negativity. They're used as a cleansing tool to cleanse a space. Altar brooms are also used to brush off an altar, to cleanse an altar, or to brush off an altar after something like a burning ritual. So they're really used in witchcraft. People who practice are also known to hang a broom upside down or to shift a broom upside down to deter unwelcome or unwanted people and guests, negative energy in general, and to sort of dispel that and protect that from even entering the home. And often these brooms used, for altar spaces or to dispel negative energy are called, I think it's besoms, Besoms. I was just at a witchy market recently, and there was a woman selling them, and they have different types of branches and different flowers and herbs and everything for different intentions. So you can kind of see how the image of riding a broomstick or even just having broomsticks was very witchy because they just weren't necessarily used for flying through the skies and transportation. There's also some more scandalous myths out there about what the wooden brooms were used for, but that's just TikTok misinformation striking again. They were just used for this farmer ritual and also for cleansing and dispelling and protecting from negative energy and unwanted guests in the home. Next, we're going to talk about those wide-brimmed black pointy witch hats. Now, there are so many theories, so I'm just going to touch on a couple, but there's a lot of reasons why some of these other theories aren't actually true. I did like this huge deep dive into witch hats for hours and hours and hours. And even though they're just a small part, maybe I'll do a deeper dive sometime on the witch hat itself. But there's lots of theories, lots of disagreement around historically where the black hat came from when it comes to your typical Halloween cartoon witch. There's theories that state back to ancient China, where in ancient graves, these women had these tall hats. They're like these almost stone-looking tall hats. There's also people believe it could be linked to Judaism. There's a lot of research that can be found and that I did read about anti-Semitism in Germany, specifically leading to the demonization of pointed hats worn by Jewish men. However, with the witch being so strongly tied to women, this is often believed not to be the case because they weren't worn by women, and witches are women. And there were also so many different styles of these hats worn in different regions that just having one black pointed hat wouldn't really make sense. What makes more sense is when wizards and sorcerers and jesters are seen with the different colored floppy but pointed hats. This would lead more to anti-Semitism than the witch's pointed black hat ever would. The first time we see a witch with a pointed black hat is in a very now famous book called the Malleus Maleficum. It is also known as the Hammer of Witches. It was from 1483 and it was basically a witch hunting or a witch hunter's guidebook. It was very popular. It has sold and printed nearly as much as the Bible has, and it was basically just a professional witch hunter manual. It plays off the fear of women's and witches' knowledge and intuition, how they are evil devil worshippers, and how they dislike children. This is the first time a witch flying on a broom and a witch in that black pointy hat is seen, and this manual started in the UK, so something coming from Germany just doesn't make as much sense. The best argument they have is that Christian women were forced to wear a specific hat if caught sleeping with or in love with a Jewish man. However, this was in Germany, and the manual with that witch's hat did come out in the UK, so it is a bit of a further conclusion to draw than taking something from the UK itself. There's also a very, very popular myth, which is that these hats were connected with ancient female ale brewers at the time, and they would wear it to stand out in a crowd. There's a very popular photo of this woman who is an ale brewer. She's a bit older and she looks a lot like your classic iconography of a witch, and she has a similar hat. And these women were known for having a lot of knowledge, especially of herbs and concoctions, as they also brewed ale. However, there's not actually a lot of historical research. This is just something in popular culture and media that has circulated off of somebody's claims that aren't historically based, because this photo is of Mother Louse, who's actually wearing a very outdated outfit for that time. It was something that a lot of people would wear when she was more a schoolgirl, and it's actually not seen in other alewives of the time. The most likely conclusion that comes with the brimmed hat for the witch is from the Quakers. This is a group who still actually exists today, and in the past they did threaten the church by pushing against things like gender norms, against income streams towards those church from taxes and other things like that. They were seen as a threat to the church and the monarchy, and they also rejected this idea of heaven and hell. In the 17th century, they were branded by the church and by the monarchy as heretics, Satan worshippers, and sexually promiscuous. Quaker women in the 16 to 1700s were often just deemed, without any proof, prostitutes, witches, and adulteresses. And this was just because they went against those societal norms. So they were seen as witches just because they were so sort of out there with their ideas when it came to beliefs, religion, and spirituality. It was said that the Quakers would just touch someone's forehead and it would magically, with all the magic, it would turn them into a Quaker. And I'll put a picture here. They wore these brimmed black hats. Some of them had a slight flop, but a lot of them stood sort of straight up, not quite to that point, but very similar to our classic witch hat. And so this idea of the witch and the Quaker woman being a witch, being perverse, caused this hat to be the marker of a witch and a Satan worshiper, which Quakers were believed to be at the time, throughout the media. This would be seen in newspaper articles, in flyers warning about the Quakers, and therefore is believed to have made it into this manual, made it into this idea of a witch. Next is a short and sweet one. We have cauldrons and potions. So I think this just comes from the herbalism side of witchcraft and paganism and similar religions outside of Catholicism and Christianity. The most mundane example would just be like kitchen witchcraft, home and hearth witchcraft, where you're cooking using intention. It also could be when, they would keep the little herbs in little small bottles to keep them separate, like this is this, this is this. It could be seen as little potion bottles, right? Simmer pots were also used in pagan times to cleanse the home, deodorize the home, and to sometimes just that, and then other times in a more witchy way to bring like fresh new energy. They often did it with the equinoxes and with the changing of the seasons. And this could be very much seen as this cauldron, because it's not like a pot, stainless steel pot that we put on the stove today. Back in the day, the hearth was the center of the home, and for larger homes, you would cook in a larger cauldron-like container, honestly just a cauldron. So when cooking in these in large quantities or using it as a simmer pot, this was then linked to witches also because it was considered more women's work, and therefore witches would be doing something like this. Then we have spells and wands, which is very, very fascinating. This comes more from witchiness. This doesn't come from just putting different things together. So there are actually very ancient examples of using spell work and wand work, and I would love to dive further into this, so let me know if that's something you're interested in. There are depictions of staffs and wands from ancient times in many different cultures to represent power, like having a staff like a king, but also to represent magic and intention and power flowing through that in an intention-like way. So like you shoot a spell, you're using that to hit your intended target, to sort of give intention to the direction in which this power and energy is going. Some of the most prolific ones are in Greek mythology. There's Dionysus, who started as a demigod, and he had a staff as his weapon of choice with a pine cone on it. And after his accolades, he was turned into a god, and his staff became not just a weapon, but something where he could direct his power into, or something he could direct his power with. And this is just repeated throughout different cultures, and this just grew into this idea of a wand being used to set direction and magical intention, and therefore had to be part of a witch. And then to finish off today, I wanted to talk about this idea of devil worship and the pentagram as a symbol of the witch and a symbol of this devil worshiping. So with devil worship and Satan worship and all of that sort of thing, it should be obvious by now, by the end of this episode, that it wasn't actually the case. It was just the demonization of women and of other religions and other beliefs and other practices. And it was said to be devil worship and demon worship and all of this to make people not want to do it and to not be open to understanding it. The pentagram originally was a very religious symbol. It spoke of ascending up this connection to the divine with the top of the star. It was used in pagan beliefs to show the ascendance of higher power and higher knowledge. It was so well known that it was put into the Rider-Waite-Smith deck in the tarot deck to be used as a sign of abundance, as a sign of prosperity, of bringing things down into your reality. And it was even used as a suit in card games long before that. It was not a symbol that meant the demonization of a religion or devil worship or satanic rituals. However, in 1855, Waite almost did himself a disservice and all of us a disservice by translating a book into English that claimed the upside down pentagon, so when it was flipped, or the pentagram when it was flipped, signified devil worship. Well, originally these were seen all the way back to Mesopotamia, carved into different structures to planetary movements or goddess worship or calling in abundance. And 5, the reason it was so sacred was because 5 was seen to represent divine human life in Pythagoras and his followers, and in ancient Greece, due to its mathematical proportions, it was really believed to be like what could create the Philosopher's Stone and something so magical. And with one translated text, it was flipped on its head. In this push away from more ancient and pagan ways, it was taken as a symbol of individualism and a push against worshiping other religions, and it was taken by the church, and now even as a sign of evil. It was said in this text that Waite translated that when flipped upside down, it showed the 2 horns of the devil, the 2 ears of the devil, and the beard of the devil. It was like that goat figure of Satan, and that's what it was when it was flipped on its head, and therefore it represented people who worshipped the devil. It didn't help in 1966 when the Church of Satan took this as like their symbol. However, it's important to realize that the Church of Satan doesn't actually worship Satan. They actually see themselves, a lot of them, as atheists, and they're just there to push against organized religion, push against this idea of worshiping a higher power, and they really embrace individualism. But with a name like Church of Satan and then taking on this pentagram, which already had started to become this idea that it had to do with Satan and this iconography of the devil, it really pushed this idea along. And so what was once a symbol of paganism and worship and divine connection is now associated with the devil, and the media ran with this. It didn't matter if it was flipped upside down or right side up. It was a sign of evil, of devil worshippers, of killers, of dark subject matter. You're seeing it in things like horror films and anything that can bring forwards this scare tactic, and it took it away from witchcraft and pagan users as something that was so divine and showing such beautiful connection, and instead it pushed them into that same categorization of devil worshippers and evil. It just helped sort of like put the nail in the coffin. So that's all I have today about witchcraft. It's a long episode. It's a long one, but I hope you enjoyed it. If there's any parts of it that you'd like me to dive deeper on, because there's so much more that can be said with the history of witchcraft in different niches, I would love to do that. If you have an idea for a different deep dive episode, I would also love to hear that. Make sure you go follow me over on Instagram at SpringLoonOracle so that you can vote every month for what you want the next month's deep dive to be. But for now, I will love and leave ya, and I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day and you decide what witch you want to be. Which one do you think? Let me know. All right, bye.